It's remarkable just how fast time flies. Cyberpunk 2077 was announced eons ago in 2012. This was years before Witcher 3 even arrived on the scene. In the intervening 8 years, the tech landscape has changed drastically, with a whole console generation coming and going. CD Projekt RED's REDEngine has also seen massive changes from its original iteration in 2011's The Witcher 2. Nearly a decade later, with Cyberpunk 2077 just months from arrival, we thought we'd do a deep dive on the latest gameplay trailer CD Projekt RED has released. Despite the fact that both Sony and Microsoft have confirmed the existence of their 9th-gen consoles, this is still a game that's slated to arrive on the PS4 and Xbox One. As we get closer to launch, it makes sense to look at the gameplay here. What's changed since our last look at Cyberpunk 2077? What stayed the same? Claims of a graphical downgrade were about the only thing that marred The Witcher 3's otherwise spectacular launch. And considering how breathtaking the E3 trailer for Cyberpunk was, we wouldn't be surprised if CD Projekt had to scale down their ambitions here to work on the base PS4 and Xbox One. So, let's have a look. A generous polygon budget. High polygon counts are a key improvement we've seen across the board in 8th gen. The use of high poly models, together with techniques like tessellation and parallax occlusion mapping, means that lots of surfaces that would otherwise end up as normal mapped textures have real geometry. With Cyberpunk 2077, CD Projekt's taken object modeling to new heights. At the gameplay trailer's intro, we see V entering an icebox. Every chunk of ice is distinct and fully rendered. A simple shader effect with water caustics would have sufficed, but instead we get individual pieces of ice, and seeing them get poured out of a bucket. This loving attention to micro-scale detail is a reoccurring theme with Cyberpunk 2077, and it's something that sets it completely apart from open-world titles out right now. You get the lived-in depth of a walking simulator, but at open-world scale. Character models and other objects are also highly detailed. V's arm and another character's head are perfectly round with none of the chunkiness. Intelligent, seamless LOD transitions. A character named Bridget says there are no borders a little of the way into the intro of this trailer. And when we get our first taste of Cyberpunk's open world, those words ring completely true. Pop-in has been a persistent issue with open-world titles on 8th-gen consoles till date. Even The Witcher 3, Cyberpunk's immediate REDEngine predecessors, suffered from far too many tree billboards magically transforming into geometry. Cyberpunk's urban environments give CD Projekt several opportunities to intelligently manage LOD transitions. Because there are so many buildings at a medium distance blocking the view further out, CD Projekt's able to prioritize loading assets in the mid-distance. This means that you end up with much less pop-in than in The Witcher 3. Shadows fall flat. As we've mentioned, allegations of a graphics downgrade marred the launch of The Witcher 3. Despite being such a phenomenally good game, the downgrade controversy left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. It wasn't CD Projekt RED's fault. You can only get so much out of a mid-range 2012 GPU and netbook processors that are found in the PS4 and the Xbox One. Apart from more aggressive LOD transitions, one of the biggest downgrades had been a change to the lighting system. In early builds of The Witcher 3, all lights were shadow casting. This looked great, but naturally came with a massive hit to performance. CD Projekt RED only managed to get The Witcher 3 working on consoles by retooling their approach to lighting. The end result still looked good, but it was notably flatter than earlier gameplay content. In a similar vein, this recent gameplay content looks a bit different from what we saw initially. It's still a visual spectacle on an unprecedented scale, but look closer at NPCs, environments, and particularly dynamic shadows, and things do look a bit more typically 8th gen. All eyes on the volumetric clouds. A reduction in quality to one aspect of the game's graphics doesn't mean everything will look worse. Case in point, the exceptional volumetric effects on full display in the gameplay trailer. Pollution and smog are important parts of the near-future cyberpunk aesthetic. We get wonderful full-resolution volumetric effects here that add much to the atmosphere. We suspect the console versions may ship with half-res volumetric effects for performance reasons, but full resolution might end up standard on PC and/or the One X or PS4 Pro. Particle volumes are lit by light-casting objects. This makes evening fog particularly striking. High-quality textures and materials. Material rendering has come a long way since the debut of REDEngine. The Witcher 3 introduced physically based material rendering. PBR isn't just a technical evolution, it requires a rethink of the art workflow, something that management may need time to implement. CD Projekt RED evidently didn't have time to implement a mature PBR pipeline in time for The Witcher 3. The features was used inconsistently, with both PBR and standard texture work used concurrently. In the 4 years that have passed, it's evident that CD Projekt RED's material rendering expertise has increased by leaps and bounds. We see the use of PBR materials everywhere, and in a gritty urban environment with loads of metal and concrete surfaces, the effect is transformative. Everything from the cheap plastic chairs to roads to rusty metal sidings look alive thanks to high-res PBR assets. This is one of those games you'll want to buy a 4K monitor for. Ray tracing makes everything look right. One of the more exciting NVIDIA RTX announcements was support for Cyberpunk 2077. Shipping the Turing-exclusive feature on a title this big meant that RTX was more than a single-generation gimmick. Cyberpunk is set to use 2 different RTX technologies concurrently. These are ray-traced ambient occlusion and ray-traced diffuse illumination. We see both of these techniques in effect in the gameplay trailer. Ray-traced AO is essentially a more accurate and higher quality alternative to SSAO. The point of SSAO is to simulate indirect shading, diffuse shadows objects cast on one another. But the main weakness of SSAO implementation is that, as the name suggests, the effect works in screen space. Accuracy is compromised here, with not areas being occluded the way that they're supposed to. And at lower sample counts, this can cause an unsightly haloing effect around objects. RTAO in Cyberpunk casts rays to figure out where occlusion happens on a given object. This eliminates haloing and results in more accurate indirect shading. It's easy to see this in some of the trailer's moodier indoor environments. Ray-traced diffuse illumination works similar to the ray-traced reflections in Control. Instead of low-res, inaccurate screen space reflections that leave out light from outside of the screen space, you get accurate, crisp reflections across a range of reflective surfaces. We've seen a lot of grimy puddles in Cyberpunk, so expect to see this effect in use pretty much all the time. Post-processing done right. Considering that it plays out in a dystopian future setting, you'd forgive CD Projekt RED for going overboard with the post-process effects to make things more cinematic. Thankfully, that's not the case here. Motion blur and depth of field are used tactfully to enhance immersiveness. You get a high-quality per-object and camera blur. The camera blur is evident in the high-speed bike sequences. Meanwhile, depth of field blur is used both in gameplay and cutscenes. Static depth of field is present in the far background, just as it was in The Witcher 3, and a high-quality dynamic depth of field effect elevates cutscene sequences. Anti-aliasing is done in screen space as well, with what looks to be a solid TAA implementation. CD Projekt RED implemented their own in-house post-process AA technique in The Witcher 3, and it wasn't exactly great. Despite featuring a temporal component, temporal coverage wasn't that great, and you'd still get quite a bit of shimmering on objects in motion. Cyberpunk features a more refined AA implementation. It's still a screen space post-process effect, but far greater temporal stability. On PC, at least, slight softness it introduces can be easily rectified with image sharpening, which is now on a driver-level feature for both NVIDIA and AMD users. Conclusion: REDEngine races towards the 9th gen. From a visual perspective, Cyberpunk 2077 is a spectacle. It's almost certainly going to redefine Western RPGs in exactly the same way The Witcher 3 did back in 2015. Its use of ray tracing effects and, critically, the depth of its world and the micro detail visible foreshadow what we're likely to see in the next generation. This is an 8th gen game at heart, but with the ample levels of detail present in the gameplay trailer, we're worried about how well it will run on consoles. But even if it's a stuttering, low frame rate mess, it's almost certainly going to be the last great AAA title to arrive on 8th gen. And boy, are we looking forward to it. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.